The Indus Valley civilization built the largest urban world of its age and then vanished so completely that for 100 years, we called them a people without a face. No kings we can name, no language we can read, no war that explains where they went. The history books had a tidy answer. Invaders swept in and wiped them out. There was just one problem. When we finally read their DNA, the invaders weren't there, and the people themselves never actually left. You might be carrying them right now. Northern India. A low mound of earth called Garhi, a few hours from Delhi. In a cemetery on the western edge of the old town, archaeologists lift 61 human skeletons out of the ground. These are the buried of the Indus Valley civilization, and everyone standing over that trench wants the same thing. Not gold, not pottery. They want the code written inside the bones. Because for a century, one question had hung over this civilization like a locked door. Where did as many as 5 million people go? They did not leave a battlefield. There are no mass graves at the great cities. No burned palaces, no conqueror carving his victory into the ruins. The streets were simply emptied, one household at a time, until the largest cities of the ancient world stood silent. And the strangest part is that these people had every tool to record what happened to them. They had a script. They carved it onto thousands of seals. We just cannot read a single word of it. And this is how thoroughly they slipped away. For nearly 4,000 years, no one even knew this civilization had existed. It was only in the 1920s that archaeologists digging in British India realized the low mounds they kept finding were the bones of a lost world, an empire the history books had completely forgotten. To understand why that empty city is so unsettling, look at what these people built. Around 2600 BC, while most of the world still lived in scattered villages, the Indus Valley ran cities on a grid, straight streets, laid at right angles, at Harappa in what is now Pakistan, and at Mohenjo-Daro to the south. Nearly every home had a private bathroom. Wastewater ran out through covered brick drains beneath the streets, into a covered public sewer system that ran the length of the streets. Their bricks were baked to a single fixed ratio, the same proportions across a territory larger than either ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. They used standardized stone weights, cut in exact multiples. At the heart of Mohenjo-Daro, they built a great watertight tank, sealed with natural tar, the earliest public bath known anywhere on Earth. Down on the coast of what is now Gujarat, at a town called Lothal, they may have built a dockyard, a basin where boats could take on cargo bound for the distant markets of Mesopotamia. At Dholavira, they carved giant reservoirs into solid rock to hoard every drop of monsoon rain. No people in the ancient world understood water better than these. They bent it, stored it, and carried it through their cities like engineers. Hold on to that, because in the end, water is the one thing they could not control. And it is the reason all of this was abandoned. More than 1,000 of their settlements have been found. The two greatest, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, may each have held between 30,000 and 60,000 people. And yet, in all of it, there's no king, no royal tomb, no giant temple to a god emperor, no throne room, no monument to a single ruler, almost no sign of an army. A civilization of this size, run with this precision, left behind no face at all. And the writing they did leave only deepens it. More than 400 different symbols pressed onto over 4,000 objects, and almost every message just a few signs long. No long inscriptions, no bilingual stone to give us a way in, the way Egyptian hieroglyphs had the Rosetta Stone. So when the cities emptied, there was no royal record to tell us why, just silence, in a script we still cannot crack. That question, where did 5 million people go, spawned a century of theories. Some blamed a great flood, others a forgotten plague, others a war. A few even reached for the shifting of the earth itself. Every generation of scholars had its favorite, and none of them could prove it. But for most of the 20th century, one answer drowned out all the others. And that answer had a villain. In the 1940s, the British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler was digging at Mohenjo-Daro when he seized on something grim. Scattered across the upper levels of the city, a handful of human skeletons, lying where they had fallen. Some looked as though they had collapsed right there in the open street. Wheeler tied them to the oldest poetry in India, the Rig Veda, which sang of a warrior people, the Aryans, storming the walled forts of the people who lived there. Their god of war, Indra, was called the Fort Destroyer. Wheeler put it in one unforgettable line. On the last day of that great city, he wrote, Indra stands accused, and the story wrote itself. Aryan charioteers had swept down from the north, stormed the cities, drove the people out, and inherited the ruins. It went into the textbooks. It stayed there for decades. A whole civilization wiped out in its sleep. There was only one problem with the massacre at Mohenjo-Daro. When later scientists went back and actually examined those bones, the case fell apart in their hands. In 1964, an American archaeologist named George Dales went looking for Wheeler's massacre and simply could not find it. The skeletons came from different layers of the city, laid down centuries apart, not a single terrible day. None of them lay near the fortified heart of the city, where a last stand would have happened. And when specialists later studied the skeletons for wounds, most showed no marks of a violent end at all. There was no siege, and there were no defenders. The most famous crime scene in ancient history was quietly coming undone. And to break it open completely, someone would have to read the victims themselves. That should have been simple. It was anything but. Ancient DNA survives best in cold, dry places. Siberian permafrost. A sealed cave in northern Europe. The Indus cities sat in one of the hottest, wettest corners of the planet, where heat and monsoon rain break genetic material down to almost nothing within a few thousand years. For years, every attempt to pull a usable genome out of Indian soil failed. The bones were there. The code inside them had all but dissolved. So when a team led by the archaeologist Vasant Shinde, working with the geneticist Vaghish Narasimhan, and the ancient DNA laboratory of David Reich at Harvard, took on the skeletons from Rocky Garhi, the odds were against them. They screened all 61 samples. 60 of them gave nothing they could use, just one. The remains of a single woman still held enough surviving DNA to try, and even she almost did not make it. The team went back to that one sample again and again, building more than 100 separate genetic libraries. From her bones, chasing fragments most labs would have written off. It was, one of them later said, a technical success story more than anything else. One woman, out of an entire civilization, agreed to speak. What she told them rewrote the story. Her DNA carried two ingredients. The first came from an ancient line related to the early peoples of the Zagros Mountains, in what is now Western Iran. The second came from the first peoples of the subcontinent itself, a deep, ancient South Asian lineage, whose closest living relatives are the hunter-gatherers of the Andaman Islands, off the coast of India. Nearly 3/4 of her ancestry was that older Iranian-related line. The rest was deep, first South Asian, braided together generation after generation into something entirely of this place. Her maternal line alone, the DNA handed down from mother to daughter unbroken, belongs to a branch called U2B2, a lineage that even now is found almost only in South Asia. But it was what her DNA did not contain that stopped the room cold. There was no trace, none at all, of the herders of the great grass steppe of Central Asia, the Yamnaya, the very people later tied to those Aryan charioteers from the Rig Veda. The supposed conquerors of the Indus were completely absent from the blood of an actual Indus woman. Her bones were so far gone that they could not even be dated directly. Her age comes from the graves around her, laid down somewhere close to 2500 BC, and she was not a fluke. Her exact genetic signature turned up again in 11 other bodies, buried far from home in ancient trading towns out in Iran and Turkmenistan. Researchers gave that shared profile a name, the Indus Periphery. And at one of those foreign towns, these Indus migrants made up roughly half of everyone the scientists tested. Indus people, living and buried abroad, carrying the same mixture. This was not one strange skeleton. This was the fingerprint of a whole population. And that same year, a second, far larger study read the DNA of more than 500 ancient people from across Asia. And it drew exactly the same map, a population with no conqueror's blood in it at all. So, where were the invaders? The answer came from the timing, and it is the quiet detail that breaks the whole case open. When geneticists mapped out when steppe ancestry finally entered South Asia, they found it arriving in a narrow window in the centuries after 2000 BC. After, the Indus cities had already begun emptying around 1900 BC. By the time any steppe herder set foot near the Indus plain, the great cities were already emptying or already gone. Line the two events up, and the accusation collapses. You cannot be conquered by someone who has not arrived yet. Whatever emptied those streets, it was not a foreign army. Because when the streets emptied, the foreign army was not there. Indra had an alibi. The steppe people did come later, and they brought something lasting with them. The deep roots of the languages spoken across much of the subcontinent today. But they arrived as heirs to a world that was already fading, not as the hand that struck it down. There was one more twist buried in that woman's genome. Her ancient Iranian-related line had split away from the peoples of Iran long before anyone farmed anything, which means farming may not have been carried into the Indus by outsiders at all. These people may have learned to grow their own food, on their own land, by themselves. None of it borrowed, none of it conquered. it was homegrown. Which leaves the hardest question of all, the one the bones alone could never answer. If nobody drove these people out, why did the greatest civilization of the ancient world walk away from its own cities? The answer was not written in their DNA. It was written in the mud of a vanishing river and in the chemistry of the rain. And that is the part that still gets me. If a single genome quietly rewriting the map of the ancient world is the kind of story you came here for, take a second and subscribe. This channel lives in these moments, where old bones meet new machines. Now, back to that vanishing river. While the labs argued over ancestry, other scientists had been reading a completely different record. Not bone, mud, stone, and ancient rain. The Indus cities were built on water, not just the Indus River, but a second great river system to the east, the Harappa, which many believe is the lost Saraswati of ancient Indian memory. Hundreds of the largest settlements sat along its banks. The geologists found something unexpected. That river was not fed by Himalayan glaciers, the way the Indus is. A study out of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, led by the geologist Liviu Giosan, traced its water back to a single source, the monsoon. It rose or fell on the rain. Around 2200 BC, the rain began to fail. It was part of something enormous, a shift in the world's climate that scientists now call the 4.2 kiloyear event. Across the northern half of the planet, monsoons weakened and drought crept in. The same dry centuries that helped bring down the Old Kingdom of Egypt and the Akkadian Empire of Mesopotamia reached the Indus. The summer rains grew thinner and less certain. Recent work on a stone formation deep in a Himalayan cave has even traced a stretch of more than 200 years, right around 1900 BC, when both the summer and the winter rains failed again and again. For a civilization that farmed on the flood, this was the slow closing of a door. The Harappa shrank from a mighty river to a seasonal stream, and in places to nothing but a dry channel in the sand. The floods that fed the fields turned erratic. The water that filled the wells and the great baths pulled back into the earth. And here is the honest part. The piece that keeps this from being a tidy disaster movie. They did not panic, they did not scatter overnight. For a long time, they adapted. They shifted from thirsty crops like wheat and barley toward hardier grains that could live on less. They planted in a different season. They held on, but you cannot outfarm a river that will not come back. Nobody sacked these cities. The land underneath them simply stopped being able to feed them. And so, over generations, the people did the only thing left to do. They followed the water, they moved east, away from the drying west, toward the wetter valleys of the Ganges and the Yamuna, where the monsoon still came. They left the grid cities behind and spread out into smaller villages and farms. They traded their standardized weights and their great covered sewers for a quieter, more scattered kind of life. Archaeologists have a bloodless name for it: de-urbanization. The cities did not fall, they dissolved. And this is where the DNA says something the empty streets never could. Because those people who walked east did not vanish into history. They kept living, they kept having children. And that ancient mixture, the Iranian-related line and the deep South Asian line braided together in one woman at Rakhigarhi, became the foundation of very nearly everyone who lives in the subcontinent today. More than 1 billion people now carry the ancestry of the Indus Valley. From Punjab in the north to the far south, from Pakistan to Bangladesh, that Harappan mixture is the single largest ingredient in modern South Asian blood. The exact blend the woman carried, so heavy with that ancient Iranian line, so free of any step, is not found in a pure form anywhere today. But its two halves are everywhere. They are, quite literally, ancestral to nearly 1/5 of the human species. If you have South Asian roots and you have ever spit into a tube for an ancestry test, that ancient split, the Iranian-related line and the deep native South Asian line, is very likely sitting right there in your results. A 5,000-year-old woman from a drowned river valley, showing up in a report on your phone. The Indus people never disappeared. They are not a lost race. They are a living one. We were simply looking for them in the ruins, when all along, they were looking back at us in the mirror. So go back to that empty street in Mohenjo-Daro, that silence that puzzled us for 100 years. It was never the silence of a graveyard. It was the silence of a house whose family has moved on. The doors left open, the lamps carried east, toward the rain. Not the end of a people, a migration, mistaken for a massacre. But the story is not finished, because that script, the one carved onto thousands of seals, more than 400 different symbols we still cannot read, is still sitting in museum drawers, holding whatever these people wanted to say about themselves. Their names, their gods. Maybe one day, their own account of the year the rivers began to fail. The bones have finally spoken. The writing has not yet. In 2025, One government in India put up a prize of $1 million for anyone who can finally read it. We found the people of the Indus. We know now that they are us. What we still do not have is their voice. That is the next mystery on this channel. The race to crack one of the last great undeciphered scripts of the ancient world, and the fortune now waiting for whoever cracks it. Until then, keep looking. The oldest questions we have are only just starting to answer back.